Hello, everyone. My name is Dee Michelle, and I'm an academic at the University of Adelaide. This is a conference paper I gave at the Carceral Geographies Conference on the 14th of December last year. The title of my paper is Beyond the Care to Prison Pipeline, and I was presenting along with my colleagues Neil Musgrove and David McInnes, both of whom are from the Australian Catholic University. Louise Henry, who is based at James Cook University, she had an idea for her creative writing PhD of writing a novel about the very different lives of her two grandmothers as they represented such diverse social experiences. One grandmother came from a wealthy family in Otago, New Zealand, and the other was in and out of foster care, kinship care, and the Townsville orphanage between the ages of 9 and 13 when she went to work. I usually chuckle or laugh inappropriately, some would say, when I think about my children's grandparents. On one side, there is eminent respectability, as the children's paternal grandfather once served as mayor of the city of Woodville, which is an inner northwestern suburb of Adelaide. There's some oddness on that side of the family too, as the grandparents were long-standing members of the Christian Science Church, a small woman-founded American denomination which emphasises spiritual healing, even as Grandpa owned a couple of successful pharmacy businesses. But mostly there is respectability. On the maternal side of the family, on my side, there is disgrace. This is part of a report by a woman police constable, Audrey Schommel, as if you wouldn't know by her name that she's a woman, who interviewed my mother in her place of work at around 9:30 p.m. on the 12th of December 1959. My mother was a short order cook at the Lewis Cafe in Bank Street in Adelaide. She wasn't expecting to finish work until 11 p.m, but was told by Constable Chommel that she needed to go home as her husband, my father, had been arrested for drunk driving. The officer was aware that there were 6 of us children at home alone, the oldest being only 9. I was 3 years of age. My mother tells the police officer that she's working because my father will be off work for 3 weeks over Christmas and they need the money she earns. I'm warning you now, Mrs. Timms, responds the constable. It is your duty to be at home with your children. 2 days later, on the 14th of December 1959, Eileen Moran, another woman police constable, interviewed my mother who wanted some advice. She had lost her job, and my father had been to court and received a £79 fine for drink driving, but he didn't have the money to pay for it. Constable Moran suggested that my mother go to the Children's Welfare Department. She said, plenty of women in your position live on relief, but if you were to leave the children with no one to care for them, I am warning you, we would have to arrest them and place them in a home. I wouldn't like that to happen, but I don't know what to do, responded my mother. Well, you know what will happen if you leave your children, said the constable. I don't remember anything about an arrest, nor do I recall appearing in the juvenile court on the 19th of January the following year. I and my siblings were all charged with being neglected, and we were committed to children's homes. My parents were imprisoned for 2 months for the neglect of their children. I wasn't in that children's home for long. I went into foster care with my younger sister on the 22nd of February 1960, and I vividly recall that day. This is where I lived until I was 18. I'm always struck by how tiny this house is. It wasn't like that when I was living there. As a young person, I was not involved at all with the juvenile justice system. I did, however, around the age of 17, have a netball coach who was a police officer, and concerned I had no knowledge of my biological parents, he organised copies of mugshots of them for me. When I consider contemporary research on the so-called care to prison pipeline, there was little likelihood that I'd end up in the juvenile justice system, even though I had been treated as a criminal when I was a small child. I had done well at school. I was even enabled to matriculate or complete high school. I didn't live in a high crime area or associate with dodgy characters, although one so-called uncle should have been locked up. I had been in the one stable foster care home. I wasn't in residential care, where police are often relied on to manage children's behaviour, as others have pointed out. Even my files have only positive comments about them, including that I should do well at university, and eventually I did, but that took a while. As an adult, the only contact with police I've had was when I was dating a copper as a young woman and when I've been a victim of crime. Unlike my biological parents, I've only ever had speeding fines, nothing more serious. Usually what is talked about in research is that children who've been in out-of-home care are overrepresented in the youth justice system and adult prison populations. I see this as an indictment on the state care system, certainly not on the children and young people, although they are all too often seen as problems to be dealt with rather than human beings with just as much potential as anyone else. And I'm quoting there from a UK politician, Barbero, adding, clearly more needs to be done for children in out-of-home care if, as Kath McFarlane says, they are, and I quote, not to be further disadvantaged by the out-of-home care system that is meant to protect. What is less talked about is that the majority of children in care do not offend, and I'm quoting from an Australian Institute of Family Studies short article by Susan Badawai in 2017. If I continue with that sentence, you can see what is highlighted and links out to a research article is the overrepresentation of kids in state care in the juvenile justice system. In other words, the emphasis is on those who do offend, although at least Badawai does have that important first clause, that is, that the majority of children in care do not offend. The BBC reported on care leavers going to university on the 30th of November 2022, and one of the young women interviewed, Rosie Campbell, said, and I quote, "It was to talk about why certain people were statistically more likely to go to university, which doesn't really help to give kids in foster care much hope for the future." Even when care experienced people do go to university, say Rosa Marvel and Samantha Child, having been in care tends to dominate the way they are seen, which is often as deviant. They go on to say, and again I quote, positive stories such as Andrew Walther and Harvey's 2017 insights into Australian care experienced students' psychological strengths are sidelined. End of quote. If we don't consider that care leavers might be in our audience, then we need to think about what prejudices, misconceptions, stereotypes we are holding. If the only story we tell is that one story of the overrepresentation of kids in care in the juvenile justice system, or the overrepresentation of people who've been in out-of-home care in the adult prison system, then we are contributing to the marginalisation and stigmatisation of all kids in the state care system. As sociologist Norbert Elias observed in the 1960s, a sure way to stigmatise and exclude any group is to tell the worst story about them, and the best story, of course, about your own group. Instead of focusing on the overrepresentation of kids from care in juvenile detention or prison, we could say that even though the majority of kids in care never offend, some do, and they're overrepresented, and we should figure out what's going on for them. We could also tell stories about people who have been in care and prison and who have gone on to become major iconic figures. South African anti-apartheid activist Nelson Mandela was in foster care from the age of 9. After spending around 27 years in prison, on the 10th of May 1994, he was inaugurated as South Africa's first Black president. He was 77 years of age. Yeah, nah, I can hear you say that example doesn't really work because Mandela was in the foster care of a chief. He was also a political prisoner. I take the point, he's not your regular crim, but still he was in prison for a total of 27 years. Perhaps African-American human rights activist Malcolm X is a better example. At the age of 13, Malcolm Little became a ward of the state. He was in foster care, juvenile detention centre before living with his sister from the age of 15. From 1946 until 1952, he was in adult prisons for burglary and larceny. Prison led to what Jed Tucker calls, and I quote, the dramatic intellectual birth of Malcolm X, and he benefited enormously from the experimental vision of Norfolk Penal Colony's Superintendent Howard Gill, who valued and promoted education for the inmates. Malcolm X famously became a member of the Nation of Islam in 1948 when he was still in prison. In 1950, he began using X in place of his family name, which, he said, replaced the white slave master name of Little that had been imposed on his forebears. Malcolm X was a controversial figure, but he is now a celebrated one. Justin Warland, in Time magazine on the 50th anniversary of Malcolm's assassination, wrote, Malcolm X is often listed beside the likes of Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks as an influential figure in the struggle for Black equality. That's because the lesson he offers about the importance of change has been constant through the decades. At the heart of his newfound status is a story of persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Probably less well known in Australia is French writer and playwright Jean Genet. Jean Genet was abandoned by his mother to a foundling home and then raised in foster care. At the age of 15, he was sent to the notorious Mettray prison. In 1948, Genee was found guilty of theft for the 10th time and only avoided automatic life imprisonment because of appeals made on his behalf by the poet and activist Jean Cocteau, with support from writers such as Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean Cocteau had organised for the publication of Genee's first novel and presented him as the greatest writer of the modern era. Thus, says Colin Ripley, and I'm quoting, Genee's writing literally allowed him to escape from prison. In Australia, of course, there is the amazing Jack Charles, famous member of the Stolen Generation, actor, activist and cat burglar, who was in and out of prison something like 22 times from the 1970s until 2006. In his 2017 TED Talk, Jack Charles talks about how he wished he had someone like him to, and I quote, implore him to lead him on a path to a better future. Although he was at times foiled by his criminal record, Jack Charles was in his later years engaged in considerable community work, including as an ambassador for the Archie Roach Foundation, mentoring young Aboriginal Australian detainees. A state funeral service to honour Jack Charles was held in October this year and live streamed into Victorian remand centres, youth detention centres and prisons. But what about the notorious criminal Lenny McPherson, Mr. Big, I hear you ask? Lenny McPherson was born in Balmain in 1921. He was the youngest of 10 children and he left school at 12. He was 13 when he was first incarcerated at Gosford Training School for Boys at Mount Penang. At Gosford, the young Lenny was physically and sexually assaulted. Gosford operated a Borstal system, says journalist Jack Hoysted. The system of punishment was, and I'm quoting, something that we'd adopted from the Brits, where the most senior kids, 16 and 17-year-olds, would mete out the discipline under the watchful eye of the guards. Lenny McPherson apparently talked about the brutality from older boys and guards for the rest of his life. McPherson's first conviction as an adult was in 1946 for receiving stolen goods, and he was sentenced to 18 months hard labour at Long Bay. He served 10 months and became a police informant. He kept up that practice once he left, surviving, say, Michael Duffy and Nick Horden, a reputation as a snitch, as Lenny the Squealer. The contacts McPherson made with the New South Wales Police while in prison were the basis for his considerable success, according to Duffy and Horden. Being a police informer allowed McPherson, says Jack Hoysted, to inform strategically against others involved in crime, but there weren't any negative consequences for him. McPherson was incarcerated again in 1953, and it was when he was on parole in 1956 that he began working with police officers Ray Kelly and Fred Cray. According to Ray Kelly, a good detective relies on informants. There were, however, allegations of Kelly being corrupt, same with Fred Cray. One of the stories about Kelly is that when McPherson beat his first wife almost to death, Kelly ensured that McPherson wasn't tried for attempted murder. Instead, his wife was guaranteed safe passage out of the state. From what I can tell, Ray Kelly was not in the care system and yet is regarded as Sydney's most powerful corrupt policeman, with some writers arguing that he continued to be a major force in Sydney's corruption for many years after his retirement. In the end, Lenny McPherson died in prison in 1996. He had been convicted 18 months earlier of conspiring to have a Sydney businessman beaten. Hoysted cites the names of a few men who were in Gosford and who became criminals, including Stan Smith and George Freeman, who, with McPherson, form what Hoysted calls the trio of Sydney crime. Hoysted is clear that not all people who have experienced the sort of trauma McPherson did turn to crime. He also knows that many of the top criminals from the 60s, 70s and 80s had been through a so-called reform school. One of those who was also in Gosford, or Mount Penang as it was by then, and an adult prison, but who also chose to give up a life of crime, is poet Robert Adamson, or the poet of the Hawkesbury, as he is also known. I want to call him the Birdman, but that name has already been given to another Robert, Robert Stroud, a notorious American murderer portrayed in the 1962 film The Birdman of Alcatraz by Burt Lancaster. Robert Adamson was 12 when he went to court for stealing birds from Taronga Park Zoo, including a paradise rifle bird. If he'd been more contrite when he went to court, he might have been let off. But he challenged the magistrate by saying he didn't think he'd done anything wrong because, and I quote, "How can anyone own a bird? Only God can own a bird." From then, and for about 10 years, he was in and out of boys' homes and adult prisons. In an interview for the ABC Radio National program Poetica in 2020, he said, "People say to me, oh, gee, you've had a hard life. You've been to boys' homes and reform school and prison. But I think if I hadn't grown up in Neutral Bay and had access to places like Balmoral and the Hawkesbury River, I would have been a big mess. But when I was ever in any deep trouble or serving solitary confinement or something like that in Long Bay, I would just visualise what it was like growing up in Balmoral or Neutral Bay or the Hawkesbury. I could be suicidal sometimes, but I think, no, don't die yet. I've got to go one more time on the river." Unsurprisingly, Robert had wanted to be an ornithologist, but he was discouraged by the qualifications required. He had trouble at school because of undiagnosed dyslexia. It was while he was in Long Bay that Robert was inspired by Bob Dylan to try writing songs. A visiting priest read his songs and described his work as poetry. Adamson says, "But then he gave me a book of Gerald Manley Hopkins' poems, which had poems about birds. So I started doing versions of those poems. I wrote a whole book of poetry." He was told he couldn't take that book of poetry out of the prison because that would be stealing government property. So he set about rewriting them and then went along to a poetry workshop at Sydney University run by writer David Malouf and academic Jim Tulip. Later, he became friends with artist Brett Whiteley, who also loved Bob Dylan. These men became great supporters of Roberts, who was soon president of the Poetry Society, editing the New Poetry magazine and setting up a small publishing business with his partner. He has won all the major Australian poetry awards, and in 2011, Robert Adamson became the inaugural chair in poetry at the University of Technology, Sydney. A final person I want to talk about briefly, so you don't think it's just the old blokes whose stories can be told, is Keenan Mundine. Keenan Mundine was born and raised on Gadigal land in Redfern. By the time he was 7, both his parents were dead. Keenan and his 2 brothers were separated and taken by relatives, and Keenan went to live in La Perouse, a suburb 14 kilometres southeast of Sydney. When he was 14, Keenan left home to find his brothers. He found one was already heavily involved in the criminal justice system and addicted to drugs. Left to fend for himself, Keenan was schooled in stealing televisions and computers by older boys and men. By the time he was 16, he was homeless, injecting heroin, and in and out of juvenile detention. At 18, Keenan was in adult prison and feeling alone and isolated. 6 years later, he decided he didn't want to go back to prison, but he found it difficult to get paid work because of his criminal record. Keenan Mundine is now married with 2 sons and is the co-founder and ambassador for Deadly Connections, an Aboriginal organisation set up to break cycles of disadvantage. One of Keenan Mundine's heroes of history is Nelson Mandela. One strand of the project I'm working on with Noel Musgrove and David McGuinness is to tell the life stories of people who've been displaced from their families as children. This is what we call a form of historical advocacy, a way of disrupting a seemingly relentless deficit discourse and instead telling stories that reinforce narratives of survival and contributions to community. Even if care leavers do get caught up in the juvenile justice or adult prison systems, that's not necessarily the end of their story. On our site, you'll find Nelson Mandela, Malcolm X, Jean Genet, Jack Charles, Robert Adamson and Keenan Mundine, although not the likes of career criminals such as Macpherson. However, not everyone on this site has been in trouble. There's Brian Tennant, for example, who wasn't in prison himself, to my knowledge, but who was involved in prison reform, helping to get innocent men released from prison and arguing for better treatment of prisoners. And then there's Ivor Knight, who in 1968 joined the Western Australian Prison Service, working his way up until in 1986 he was appointed superintendent of Fremantle Prison. People who've been in the state care system aren't an homogenous group, and we should ensure that we don't tell the one negative story about them, even when our intention is to improve their situation. Thank you for listening.